Hi, I'm Joel Popadics and welcome to my studio. A couple of years ago, I went on a painting trip to Greece with my son Luke and my good friend and fellow artist John Osborne. We painted the temple ruins in Athens and in Delphi and visited Aea, a traditional Greek village on the island of Santorini in the Aegean Sea. Aea is dotted with windmills, which is something that I have always wanted to paint ever since I read Don Quixote in college. In this video, we're going to paint a dramatic sky using a tricky wet and wet technique. We'll learn how to float warm, reflected color into the cool blue shadows of a white windmill, and put a Mediterranean breeze into some clothes drying on a laundry line. Before you try this video, go to my website at watercolorpop.com, and on the Paint Along with Pop page, download my notes and reference. You'll find the links to it in the description box below. I suggest you watch it all the way through and then rewatch it as you paint, pausing as needed. I always like to start with a little inspiration from artists whom I admire. I had Ogden Pleisner's watercolor, Mill and Algarve, in mind when I did my watercolor sketch in Greece. Although his pictures from Portugal, the subject and sky are similar to what we're going to do today. His soft-edged cumulus clouds look so spontaneous and fresh. We'll try to capture that as well. The sky in Winslow Homer's watercolor, Sponge Fishing Nassau, is typical of how he handled white puffy clouds. Instead of using a wet and wet technique, he painted his cloud forms with a hard-edged approach. It's different, but just as effective. John Pike did a terrific job with the shadows and reflected light in his watercolor, Windmills in Spain. Look at how he floated orange and red into the cool blue shadows in the buildings in the background. With these images in mind, let's begin. We're going to use a wet and wet technique to paint the sky. So first, let's wet the entire sheet of paper with a big wash brush loaded with clean water. Put a little cadmium orange for the light parts of the clouds that are closer to the top of the painting, and some cadmium scarlet red for the ones further back. Roll the paper around to pour off the excess paint and to allow all the colors to wet blend together. As the paper dries a little bit, let's mix up some cobalt blue for the sky. The shine on the paper is beginning to disappear, so it's a good time to do the openings in the clouds. You'll know if the timing's right if you get a nice soft edge to the blue shapes and the paint doesn't spread out all over the place. My students always ask me, how long should I wait? 1 minute, 5 minutes, 10 minutes? I wish I had a definite answer, but it really depends on how humid it is. When doing the wet and wet technique, you don't want a brush loaded with water, so always dab your brush into a paper towel before you go to the moist paper. The shadows on the bottom of the clouds are grayer and slightly violet in color, so I mix a little cadmium red, cobalt blue, and ivory black. I paint the shapes on an oblique, working in from the corners, and this leads the viewer's eyes into the composition. I make the clouds straighter and more level as we approach the horizon. Notice how big I've made the cloud at the top of the paper and how much smaller and thinner they are as they go back. Mix a little Winsor blue green shade and add a little water to lighten the valley for the distant blue sky. Add more shadows to the bases of the clouds, keeping them thinner in size as well. Make sure the paper is completely dry before we mass in the windmills and landscape. I use a hairdryer when I work in the studio. Let's mix a large quantity of Payne's Gray. Not the Payne's Gray that you buy, but one that we mix using cobalt blue and ivory black. You can also mix Payne's Gray using color complements, like cobalt blue and orange, for example. I'm starting with the windmill in the back. The color at the top of the windmill is bluer, and I add some orange and red into the Payne's Gray as I work my way down. Continue to change the color and make it lighter in value here and there. This is for the reflected light that occurs within the shadows. But be gentle with this variation. It's helpful to roll the paper around to blend the color smoothly and to prevent the wash from drying. Work quickly as you paint, but carefully, making interesting shapes as you mass in. The right side of the windmill in front is receiving some direct sunlight, so I want to make a soft edge along the shadow as it meets the light. We call this area the halftone. It's a fancy word for a soft edge. There's some white clothing hanging on a laundry line in front of the windmill. Its color and value are similar to the shadows in the white buildings, so I'll continue to use Payne's gray, cobalt blue, cadmium orange, and cadmium scarlet for the reflected colors. Every now and then, I have to revisit the edge on the shadow of the windmill and soften it with some more clean water. I slow down now as I paint so that I make an interesting shape for the shirts hanging on the laundry line. Every now and then, drop in some clean water and orange here and there for the reflected color. And again, back to that pesky halftone with more water on the windmill. Before I finish up with the laundry, I'll drop some more water to lighten the value. The stonework on one of the white walls in the back has some rocks visible. The paper's damp, so I'll put some darker gray here and there and hope for a happy accident. Light is hitting the top edge of the wall in front, so I'm careful to leave a little white paper to suggest it. I mix some brown using a combination of ivory black, cadmium orange, cerulean blue, and a lot of water for the gravelly dirt that's everywhere in the foreground. Don't make this color too dark or complicated as you paint it in. And every now and then, put in a wash of light blue for the sky plane. On the far right, we are able to see the mountains on the other side of the caldera. I mix a very blue Payne's gray and mass in the mountain shape. I put a soft edge on the bottom of the mountain where it'll eventually meet the greenery in the front. During the 12th and 13th centuries, windmills were first introduced to the Greek islands. Since then, over 600 windmills were constructed to grind grain for bread. They were situated along the coast to take full advantage of the breeze. The straw-covered roofs rotate according to the direction of the wind. I mix some ivory black, cadmium orange, and cadmium red for the straw's color, and add cobalt blue for the shadow side. I'm trying to paint its shape ragged and pointed, so I use the flat side of my brush. The shadow on the windmill is still a little wet, so I'm careful not to let the brown bleed too far into it, but I kind of like how it mingles together. Paint as straight a line as you can for the windmill's blades. I like to do that quickly, and I don't care if it's not perfect. We really struggled with the greens in Greece. The vegetation is so different from what we're used to here in the United States. I was mixing all sorts of yellow and blue combinations for the olive trees and bushes. What worked best was mostly French ultramarine blue and cadmium orange for these greens, and I would occasionally mix cerulean blue and cadmium yellow for variety. Scrape the side of a flat brush for texture. I mass in the bushes with a sunlight value. I'll mix a darker green with more French ultramarine blue later for the shadow side. Don't mass in the bushes in one by one. Treat it as a unified group. We'll make separations later with the shadows. Make large, medium, and small-sized clusters of vegetation. Create a shapely bottom edge to the bush where it meets the ground. I add some additional darker brown into the dirt. Again, I scrape the side of a flat brush for texture. I use a script liner brush to paint in a few sticks here and there. Don't overdo the sticks and arrange them into different sized clusters. Using a 1/2 inch flat brush, mix a very dark Payne's gray with ultramarine blue and ivory black to paint the windows on the windmill. I find it's much easier to paint a rectangular shaped object using a flat brush rather than a round. Mix the shadow green with more blue than yellow for the shadows on the bushes. Remember, the light is coming in from the right, so the shadows will be on the left side and underside of the bushes. Some of the lighter green is still wet, so I'm getting a soft edge for the halftone. My shadows are all different sizes, so I make large, medium, and small groups of darker green. I mix some ultramarine blue and alizarin crimson for the darkest values within the greens. And using a script liner brush, I put a few strokes here and there. Finally, I mix in some French ultramarine blue into my leftover stick color for the shadows that are on the tops of the windmills. I hope you enjoyed this demo. To find out more about me and my art, visit my website at watercolorpop.com. Please subscribe to my YouTube channel to see new videos as they are released. You'll find a link to it below. If you enjoyed this video and like to leave me a tip, I'd greatly appreciate that. On the Paint Along with Pop page on my website, click on the commerce button that says Tip Joel. No worries if you can't. Keep watercoloring and stay well.